In this episode, we're going to take risk management past the point where many beginners stop, which is the moment a control is chosen or a risk is written down in a register. In OT, identifying risk and even treating risk is only part of the job because risk continues to exist, controls drift, environments change, and new dependencies appear. Monitoring and disposition is the ongoing practice of tracking what risk remains, detecting when risk changes, and deciding what to do next, using clear governance rather than wishful thinking. This is where terms like residual risk and risk disposition start to matter, because they describe what is left after controls are applied and what decision the organization makes about living with that remainder. Beginners often assume risk management is a one-time event with a report at the end, but in OT, a risk program that does not monitor and disposition becomes stale and unreliable. It also becomes dangerous because people can develop confidence based on old assessments that no longer match reality. The goal of this lesson is to help you understand how residuals are tracked, why audits matter without becoming the main point, how reporting supports real decisions, and how escalations in governance keep risk from becoming invisible. When you understand these mechanics, risk management becomes a living system rather than a document. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Residual risk is the risk that remains after you implement controls, and it is unavoidable because no control is perfect and no environment is static. In OT, residual risk can remain because you cannot patch legacy systems immediately, because you must allow some remote access for support, or because segmentation cannot be perfect due to operational dependencies. Residual risk is also influenced by uncertainty, such as incomplete visibility into firmware versions or undocumented connectivity that has not yet been validated. Beginners sometimes interpret residual risk as failure, like you did not solve the problem, but in reality residual risk is simply the truth that controls reduce risk, they do not erase it. The purpose of naming residual risk is to avoid pretending a control makes a scenario impossible when it only makes it less likely or less severe. A mature program describes residual risk in terms of what could still happen, what the consequences would be, and what signals would indicate risk is changing. This helps leaders understand why some risks remain high even after significant work, especially in safety-critical areas where constraints are strict. When residuals are tracked honestly, the organization can make informed decisions rather than being surprised by the limits of controls. That honesty is part of operational safety and resilience. Disposition is the decision about what to do with a risk, and it usually falls into a few practical patterns even if you do not label them formally. You can mitigate the risk by adding or improving controls. You can accept the risk because it is within tolerance or because change is too risky. You can transfer parts of the risk through contracts or insurance. Or you can avoid the risk by changing the design or removing the activity that creates it. In OT, mitigation often involves a mix of technical and procedural controls, like strengthening remote access, tightening change management, and improving monitoring. Acceptance in OT must be handled carefully because it should be explicit, owned, and tied to conditions that make the acceptance reasonable, such as compensating controls and a review schedule. Beginners sometimes think acceptance is giving up, but acceptance can be responsible when mitigation would create greater operational hazard. The key is that acceptance should be a decision, not a default state created by delay. Disposition also implies follow-through, because choosing to mitigate means you assign tasks and deadlines, and choosing to accept means you document rationale and monitor conditions. When disposition is disciplined, risk management produces action and clarity rather than endless discussion. Monitoring risk in OT includes watching both the environment and the controls, because risk changes when either one changes. The environment changes when new assets are added, new connections are created, vendors change support models, or processes are modified. Controls change when configurations drift, exceptions accumulate, accounts persist beyond their intended lifespan, or monitoring coverage breaks. Beginners often think monitoring means looking for intrusions, But risk monitoring is broader because it includes signals that exposure is increasing even if no attack is present. For example, a new remote access pathway is a risk signal, and so is an increase in undocumented changes or a drop in backup test success. Monitoring also includes tracking known risks over time, such as whether a legacy system remains isolated as intended or whether a compensating control is still enforced. In OT, effective monitoring is often about a few high-value signals rather than an overwhelming amount of data because teams need actionable information they can trust. This is why monitoring is tied to control calendars and governance, because routine reviews help detect drift before it becomes a major exposure. When monitoring is purposeful, it becomes early warning, not just noise. Disposition also involves deciding when risk has changed enough to require reassessment, because not every change is significant. A minor configuration change in a low-criticality system might not require updating a risk decision, but a new conduit between the business zone and a control zone might. Similarly, a vendor announcing an important vulnerability affecting widely deployed OT software might change likelihood estimates and drive new mitigation decisions. Beginners sometimes assume reassessment happens on a fixed schedule only, but in practice reassessment should be triggered by meaningful change events as well. These triggers can include major upgrades, new integrations, changes in remote access models, discovery of undocumented assets, or changes in threat activity relevant to the industry. The goal is to keep the risk picture current without constantly restarting the assessment process. A mature program defines what counts as a trigger and ensures someone is watching for those triggers. This is part of making risk management sustainable because it balances stability with responsiveness. When triggers are clear, the organization can adapt without chaos. Audits play a role in monitoring and disposition because they provide independent checks that controls exist and are being maintained. For beginners, audits can feel like punishment or bureaucracy, but in risk terms, an audit is a way of verifying that the controls you rely on are still real. In OT, audits can reveal gaps like missing access reviews, undocumented exceptions, incomplete change records, or untested backups, which are not just compliance issues, they are resilience issues. Audits also help maintain discipline over time because busy teams can deprioritize routine tasks unless there is accountability. The danger is when audit becomes the main goal, because then the program can devolve into evidence theater, where documents are created to look good rather than to reflect reality. A healthy approach treats audit as feedback, not as the purpose, and uses audit findings to improve controls and to update risk dispositions. In OT, the best audit outcome is a clearer understanding of what is working and what is drifting, which informs decisions about where to invest effort next. When audits are integrated into the program, they reduce surprises and build trust with leadership and regulators. They also provide a baseline for measuring improvement over time. Reporting is the bridge between monitoring and decisions, because information without communication does not change behavior. In OT risk management, reporting should translate technical observations into operational consequences and actionable choices. Beginners sometimes think reporting is simply listing risks and their ratings, but good reporting highlights trends, changes, and decision needs. It should show what residual risks remain high, what controls are performing well, where drift is occurring, and which risks are approaching tolerance thresholds. Reporting should also include context, such as major maintenance periods, modernization projects, or vendor changes that explain why certain metrics moved. In OT, reporting often needs to reach different audiences, like plant managers, engineering leaders, and enterprise risk leaders, and each audience needs a slightly different view. Plant leaders may need to know which controls affect maintenance windows and operations, while enterprise leaders may need to understand exposure across multiple sites. The goal is consistency, meaning the underlying risk picture is the same even if the presentation differs. When reporting is clear and consistent, it supports governance rather than creating confusion. Reporting is how the organization stays aligned. Escalations are the mechanism that ensures high-risk conditions and persistent control failures reach the people who can make decisions and allocate resources. In OT, escalation matters because some issues cannot be solved at the local level, like major network redesign needs, replacement of unsupported systems, or contract changes needed to control vendor access. Beginners sometimes hear escalation and think it means blame, but escalation is better understood as routing, meaning sending the issue to the right decision maker. A mature escalation process defines thresholds, such as when a critical control fails repeatedly, when a residual risk remains above tolerance for too long, or when a new vulnerability affects a critical system with limited mitigation options. It also defines what information is included in the escalation, such as the scenario, the potential consequence, the current controls, and the options available. This prevents escalations from becoming emotional appeals and makes them decision-ready. Escalation also supports safety because it prevents local teams from feeling pressured to implement risky changes without proper authority. When escalations are clear and predictable, they reduce chaos by making decision pathways explicit. This is how governance becomes operational. Decisions are the outcome you want from monitoring and disposition, and decisions should be documented because OT environments rely on memory and continuity over time. A decision might be to implement a control improvement, to accept a risk with conditions, to fund a modernization effort, or to change a vendor access model. Decisions should include acceptance criteria, timelines, owners, and review points, because without these, decisions become intentions that fade under operational pressure. Beginners sometimes assume decisions happen only in formal meetings, but decisions are happening constantly in OT, often through what is prioritized, what is delayed, and what is approved during maintenance windows. A disciplined risk program makes these decisions explicit, which improves accountability and reduces hidden risk. Decision documentation also supports learning, because if an incident occurs later, the organization can review what was known and what was decided and improve the process rather than guessing. In OT, learning is critical because environments evolve and teams change, and a program without memory will repeat mistakes. Clear decisions are therefore a control in themselves because they prevent drift and ambiguity. When decisions are explicit, the program becomes stronger. Residual risk monitoring also benefits from linking to maturity indicators, because maturity shows whether your ability to manage risk is improving even when residuals remain. For example, a legacy device may remain unpatched, but if it is now isolated, monitored, and covered by tested recovery, the residual risk may be lower and more acceptable. Similarly, remote access may remain necessary, but if access is now time-limited and logged, the residual risk becomes more controlled. Beginners often interpret residual risk as static, but residual risk can decrease as your program matures and as controls become more reliable. That is why monitoring should track both the residuals and the control health, such as whether access reviews are happening, whether backups are tested, and whether change records are complete. This combined view prevents overreacting to residual risk that is well managed and prevents complacency about residual risk that is unmanaged. The program becomes smarter because it distinguishes between unavoidable risk and avoidable drift. When you can explain that distinction, you can allocate resources more effectively. This is how monitoring supports strategy, not just compliance. Finally, monitoring and disposition in OT is about keeping the risk conversation connected to reality, so the organization stays safe, resilient, and honest about its exposure. Residual risk is not a failure. It is a normal outcome of controls and constraints, but it must be tracked and governed. Audits provide independent feedback that controls are real. Reporting translates technical observations into decision language, and escalations ensure high-impact issues reach the right authority. Most importantly, decisions turn information into action, and documentation preserves those decisions so the program has memory and consistency. For beginners, the main takeaway is that risk management is a living system, and it only works when the organization keeps watching, keeps learning, and keeps deciding. OT environments change slowly and then suddenly, and a monitoring posture helps you catch the sudden changes without panic. When you treat monitoring and disposition as routine, you reduce the chance that risk becomes invisible and grows quietly. That is how OT risk management becomes something you can rely on, not just something you do once. And it is how you build a program that stays effective long after the initial assessment is complete.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.